Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Tracy Stein, as always. I'm so happy to be here with you. And today's topic and guest are going to be the change you weren't even fully aware you needed, because all of us could do this better, me and everyone else I know, and it's listening. So I'm here with listening expert Christine Miles. I'll tell you a little bit about her, but then I'm going to let her tell her story. So
here we go.
So Christine Miles is the founder and CEO of Equipped, a woman-owned training, consulting, and product company. She's the developer of The Listening Path and the author of What Is It Costing You Not to Listen? The Power to Connect, Influence, Solve, and Sell. It's an award-winning book on listening to understand, and who doesn't need that? Now, Christine has been doing this for more than 25 years. She's been teaching individuals and organizations how to listen in ways that transform how they connect, how they influence, solve, and succeed in every aspect of life. And I'm already thinking about 100 ways this could improve our lives. But using her proven system, Christine teaches people how to harness emotional intelligence and empowers them to create cultures of empathy and understanding that drive performance and results. Christine's approach has been implemented at Fortune 100 companies, universities, law firms, and privately held companies nationwide. Without further ado, Christine, I really just want to have you start talking about your work and your story and what got you involved in this. Because who does not need to listen better?
I appreciate what you said, that it's a problem most of us don't know we have, which is why I called my book, What Is It Costing You Not to Listen? Because you can't fix something you don't know is broken. And we don't know it's broken because nobody's told us it's broken. We're told to listen. We're not taught to listen. And to me, that's the fundamental gap. You can't get better at something you don't know you're supposed to get better at. So I just happened to, my backstory is I learned to listen differently as a child for lots of reasons, but primarily because I grew up with a mother who suffered from mental illness that stemmed from the loss of her mother. So my mother was motherless her whole life. And as a result of that, she had, despite her exterior, which was warm and funny and charismatic and loving, below the surface, she had a lot of pain that she harbored that most people didn't see. So I learned to pay attention to things that most people didn't. And by proxy, I learned how to listen to understand. And then I started to realize that I was overachieving only because of that skill. I'm quite average otherwise. I wish I were being modest, but it's true.
I'm not sure.
You can be pretty sure. Trust me, I have the proof. It dates back, but there's a lineage of proof. But the skill that I learned has really helped me navigate to a lot of successful things. So you see the outcome, you don't see what it really took. And then when I started working with families, I started as a therapist at 22, believe it or not, knocking on people's doors, saying, I'll be your family therapist. Yeah, they had that look on their face too. What? But I didn't try to tell them what to do. I tried to understand them because I didn't really know what to tell them in part, and I was good at the listening part. But what I saw was a lot of the failures were around what people didn't understand, not what they said. And so I've spent a lifetime and a career really honing in on how to fix the communication paradigm. It's been backwards. We've been teaching people to speak, to know, to tell, but we rarely teach them how to listen. And that's where I believe the biggest fix is in relationships, in business, and education. It's such a critical skill.
That is so true. And I want you to know, in full disclosure, whenever I'm going to interview a guest, I do the normal things people probably assume I do. I go to their website, I look at their social media, and, I try and find at least one interview so that I get a better sense of them. And, if you're a therapist, you're listening with your third ear too,
Yeah.
right? And I didn't even need to do that with your interview because it was so clear. The what and the why were so clear about, not only your passion for helping people listen, but what a crappy job most of us do. And I'm not trying to insult anybody, but I'm guilty of it as well. And I'm a trained listener.
Yeah. Did
Um,
you have training? I'm curious. Did you have actual training?
so it's interesting. This is going to be a little bit of a diversion
That's
or
okay.
a digression from the main artery of what we're talking about. But as I was listening to your interview, I was thinking, there are so many different ways to be trained as a therapist,
Yeah.
and people who've trained in psychotherapy know that, but people on the outside see us as this kind of monolith.
Yeah.
And, I remember my training was largely psychodynamic, which has evolved, thankfully, over the
Yeah.
last 100 or so years. But I remember being told you ask too many questions
Wow. Wow.
because, I was supposed to only really listen
Yeah.
and be a blank slate. And in some people's minds, I don't personally think that's effective. I think reflective listening and asking good questions makes all the difference. And it
Yeah.
makes people feel understood. You talk so much about that. So I want to give you the floor on that. But I was just like, yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
when I was listening to your interview.
Well, first of all, I love that you kind of debunked the psychodrama, the psychoanalytic stuff, because it's hard to be a blank slate. It's really hard, and so I
It's
agree
not
that.
possible.
Yet we're blank slates in our relationships all the time, which is kind of the metaphor there. So pause. Maybe I'll get back to that. So the reason I asked you about the training is because as a therapist, and I was trained by the second generation for those therapist geeks of Salvador Minuchin. So I was trained through the Philadelphia Children's Hospital, Pennsylvania, by his proteges. And high level training, incredible, was 22, never had a course on listening. Master's degree in psychology, trained therapist, never. So what the heck? And we're the ones who are supposed to be trained. Most people, 2% of people have any kind of listening training worldwide, and it's usually a sliver. So we're doing it more than 55% of the day and spending 0 years of education on it. It's crazy from that standpoint. So we're failing for that reason. We're failing because technology is making it harder for us to listen, yet it's not the root cause. The root cause is our brains are the greatest enemies of listening.
Please talk about that.
So if you break the brain down and you look at it like neuroscientists do and psychologists, it's an iceberg. So we have what's on top of the water and below the water. So we can go really deep into the unconscious. That's the third level of the brain. That's more your realm. But we have the conscious and subconscious. And what we're aware of is above the water. It's a small portion of our brain. What we're unaware of, our subconscious brain is in charge most of the time. And it's like an impetuous child that's pulling us in directions to telling us to do everything but listen. So we need to calm and soothe that beast. So what I believe the definition of emotional intelligence is getting everything to the conscious level, right? As much as possible from that subconscious to conscious, because then we're operating with thought, not just our limbic emotional brain. But most of the time, the limbic emotional brain is in charge, which is why it's so tough. So there's so many enemies like impatience, being distracted, thinking of your own story. Asking questions can be an inhibitor, believe it or not. It's helpful, but it's also an inhibitor. Rehearsing, problem solving. The list is very long. So that's why we're failing, because we don't have the tools or the training to calm and control that superpower of our brains.
And it's funny because as I was listening to your interview and looking over some of the wonderful wisdom from your book, it's an underrated skill. I feel like societally, we don't place enough overt and conscious value on listening because we're really socialized. And I feel like especially the last few decades, we're socialized to have to come up with our elevator pitch, which is not wrong to have.
No.
But to sell ourselves in relationships, in friendships, at a party, at a job interview, on the job, and honestly, even as a therapist, I'm a human being. I'm sure there are a lot of times when I'm saying probably too much and not hearing enough.
Yeah, so this isn't a modern problem. This is a problem that feels modern, and storytelling came hot on the landscape in 2010. So since 2010, it's like tell your story, tell your story, tell your story. I firmly believe in that. We teach storytelling. I speak for a living. There's lots of storytelling. It's important, but it's the secondary skill, because how do you know what story to tell if you don't know what story the audience needs to hear first and foremost? So everything you do, all marketers do, is figure out what you need to say to the audience to move them. That's a listening skill before you're a telling. So we just have it in the reverse order, I think. But this goes back to Roman times, ancient Roman times, oratory skills, rhetoric, oratory skills, rhetoric. So we just haven't changed that paradigm. And my theory is in part because it's just been too hard. It's just been too hard. Active listening came out in 1957. It's all the principles that we believe are important. How do we understand the meaning of what is said more than just the words? But active listening is incredibly complex and not easy for the average folk to do, especially without training, because you're not withhold judgment, hold space, make sure you make eye contact, make sure you watch body language. There's like 11 to 12 key behaviors of active listening that aren't natural for most people, especially when you don't have training. So it's just been too hard to figure out.
So talk about how you tell me where you want to go next with this, because I have about 100, again, different questions in my mind and ways I'm thinking about how this would be helpful. But maybe tell me what you think are the most important facets of listening well, why we need to listen well.
Yeah.
In what situations and how we can do that better.
So some people will say they're better situational listeners, by the way. If they say, well, if at business, I do a really good job at this because I have a deal to close, I have something to negotiate. So there's more of it of paying attention versus maybe at home. I think that's maybe true. We think good intentions are enough to listen well, when in fact it's still, people still fail. But I think it really goes back to starting with, when was the last time somebody didn't listen to you? How to make you feel, right? Your boss interrupting you, your child ignoring you when you're trying to ask them to clean up their room because they're absorbed in their phone. Whatever the story, like, how did that make you feel? When you think about that, it's not warm and fuzzy. It's irritated, frustrated, unimportant, invisible. So we have to tap into what those moments feel like, because the consequences aren't obvious right away. It's death by 1,000 cuts. It's like each instance of not listening creates a small wound until, the people are bleeding out. I remember as a young therapist, I'm like, why do people divorce after 20 years? Well, those wounds, right? Those wounds distance people. So when we think about how it makes us feel, and then we go, well, when was the last time I didn't listen? Because we're both we're guilty and we receive. Then we start to think, oh, there is more of an impact here. So then how do we start to do something different about it? But if you just go on those small surface wounds, you're not going to feel it, because you're going to miss most of those obvious signs.
I'm just thinking too, whether it's your boss not listening to you, right? Or you're trying to help your employee know that something's really important, or you're trying to tell a friend about something that you're struggling with, and maybe it's hard to get the words out, or your partner. And you're absolutely right. People are more aware of how they feel. A lot of times I feel like it's a harder leap for them to get that, oh, the person across from me can feel the way I have felt.
Right.
Some people are more naturally wired to do that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are not.
Yes. Yeah. And we need to tap into both. I remember when I was dating, I told a story in my book. I got a lot of second dates because I was such a great listener. I thought I was fabulous. I'm like, oh, I get a lot of second dates. And then I went, I'm not talking about myself. I'm only talking about them. And they were falling in love with themselves, not with me. So it was like, what am I doing? So I actually started talking more, and I got less second dates, just interestingly. Yeah.
Oh my God. I have no trouble understanding that, by the way.
It just makes sense, right? Because when we listen in a way that people feel they're understood, it is game changing. So you become one of the most important, powerful people in the room. That's the power of listening. I always say it earns you the right to do everything else. So you want to advise, listen, to understand before you try to jump in. We jump to telling. Telling rarely works, but when we understand, and then it earns us the right. That's why it earns us the right to connect. It earns us the right to influence. It earns us the right to problem solve. But most people jump to telling right away. And that's because that's what we've been taught to do.
100%. So I have my million questions that I always jot down. You've talked about already a little bit about how even in childhood you knew that listening was a really important skill. Mm-hmm. And it really does give you an advantage in so many ways, just interpersonally.
Yep.
You've talked a little bit about business and how business relationships can be better, but also it sounds like more effective.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you teach people to do this in the workplace and how it unfolds. How does it change things?
Yeah, so there's so many problems that it causes in business that are unnoticed. Like I said, most of the problems that I've solved and we've solved as a company is about what's misunderstood. So let's just take a meeting, for example. So many meetings and so little success of meetings by and large. And part of it is because of the amount statistically we retain. So when we listen, most people listen to 25% of what they hear. So 100%, now we're 25. Now of that 25, they retain 17 to 25%. So let's take a meeting, 60-minute meeting. That's 15 minutes that they actually heard.
Maybe.
And 4 minutes, exactly, and 4 minutes that they've retained. Now multiply that by 5-10 people in a meeting and look what a mess you have. So what I say is we don't have a common language to do that together. It's like reading. If you spoke, or languages, if you spoke Japanese and I spoke Spanish and somebody else spoke Russian, we're in a meeting together, we wouldn't understand a thing. That's pretty much the analogy here, because we don't have a common way to make sure we're understanding before we talk and tell. So what I've created is that language, that tool set to understand it when you have a common way to do it, not just behaviors, but actual things that you do, tools that you enact, then that common language unifies how we understand collectively and individually. So that's what the listening path is called. So it's the path to understanding. And the metaphor is you wouldn't go hiking in the woods for a week unprepared.
I hope not.
Right. If you had the opportunity, you'd want a tent, you'd want some toilet paper, you'd want some things, right? We go into the conversational woods all the time unprepared. We're winging it. And speakers, because we like to speak, but we're terrible storytellers for the most part.
I could not agree with you more, and guilty as charged. My husband tells me all the time that I'm a terrible storyteller. So I do know that it is a learnable skill to some extent. Some people are just naturally great at it.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that more?
Sure.
Because no one teaches you to do that.
And I'm going to get ahead of this a little bit. So storytelling and listening, or story gathering, as I call it, are the same skill inside out. So when you tell a story, it's a series of events linked together to make a point. In business, you want to make the right point. In marketing, you want to make the right point. Story gathering or listening is taking the speaker on a journey to discover the insight of that story. Same path. It's just one's telling it out and one's getting it, uncovering it. So you follow the same path, and stories have there's a proven model to stories, right? There's the 3-act, or there's the hero's journey: beginning, struggle, tipping point, ending, or new beginning. And that's the path we follow. And what you realize is that people have all those elements, they just don't tell them in order. So most people start in the middle, not at the beginning. So they confuse the listener from the moment, and they're both, where are we? That's probably, your husband just calls you out on it, right? What are you talking about? So we don't know that, though. We're not trained to know that. So you as a clinician, people come in and they start with the problem, not with the beginning, right? Our job is to uncover that story and unpack that so they can discover insights and meaning so they can shift behavior. It's the same with selling. It's the same with leading. It's the same with managing a project. It's the same with having an innovative breakthrough. You got to know what problem you're solving, then you got to figure out where you've been and where you need it to go.
One of the things I know you've talked about a little bit, and I'm hoping you can talk about it more, because I think it's such an underrated quality, I guess, is being curious. I think a lot of people lack genuine curiosity. Not everybody. But if you're actually curious, I feel like it's much easier to get the information you need to be either better in a business relationship or in a personal relationship.
Yeah, so let's talk about curiosity. So there's something called a closeness bias. So knowledge and experience is the enemy of listening, because the more we know, the less curious we become. I live in the Philadelphia area. I quite frankly don't go to the Liberty Bell anymore. I've seen it a few times. Like, I know where the crack is. I know the backstory. I don't need to go there to visit it, right? I'm not curious about it anymore. So our relationships, we're not as naturally curious. The more we know somebody, the more we think they know somebody, the less curious we become. So curiosity is something we're wired with. It's something we learn, and it's also something that goes away the more we know something. So we have a lot of problems there. So I don't expect people to be curious. I think you got to give them the tools to be curious. And one of the tools is one of the tools on the path, which is what I call the compass, which is how do you guide the speaker to tell their story, getting all the parts. We tend to chase facts, but not feelings, but we really need to ask about both, because stories have two parts of the narrative. So one of the reasons we struggle to be curious is we drill down just on facts rather than how people feel. So the compass is what we call the 6 most powerful questions to help you get the speaker's story. And there's 4 situational story fact questions and 2 feeling questions. If you only use those 6 questions, you're guaranteed to get both.
So let's dive into that.
Okay.
Tell us about the 6 questions. I actually did write them down.
Okay.
but I want you to talk about them.
Sure.
And also, how might they apply in a particular situation? So
I actually have a story about that. So I'll tell you the 6 questions, and I'll tell you how somebody just reached out to me. So the 6 questions are this. So when you're listening, you're always listening to a story. So parents, let's give a parent example. Parents will say, I asked my kid how their day was, and they say good. I go, yep, you're in the middle of the story. You just don't know it. You think they're going to not say anything else. You've got to learn to get that story. So the first question is, take me back to the beginning. All right. Where did your day start? Changes the conversation. I had breakfast, Mom. Okay, tell me more. Second question. Now we're in a different, not good and stop. Okay, good, and I'm going to explore. So take me back, tell me more. Then what happened? How did that make you feel? So now we're on to the feeling questions. And why? Because great listeners use these questions, including the which is a natural, almost imperceptible way you get someone to tell you more. You're doing it now. I don't know if you know. And
with my nodding.
Yeah, with your nodding. And the last one is, it sounds like you felt, and you name an emotion. Now, most people, according to Brene Brown's research, out of the 7,000 people she researched with, can name 3 emotions. So if you can get to 4, if you name an emotion of not the happy, glad, sad, you're already different when you say, hey, it sounds like you felt terrified. You felt overwhelmed. You felt horrified. You get to an emotional level like that, you're already changing the conversation. But those are the compass questions. So we encourage people to only use those questions when they're learning to listen and see what happens, to gather a story from someone. So a very kind and very smart guy that I met yesterday, I just was amazed by him, read my book, and he talked about how he was in recovery for 8 years. Very open, very genuine. And he said, I listened to your book twice, and I decided I'm gonna sit down with my sponsor, who I've known for the time of my recovery. We know each other incredibly well, and I'm only going to use those 6 questions. He said they had the most amazing conversation. At the end of it, his sponsor said, I've only told 2 people in my life what I just told you. You're the second person.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And he said, I thought it was great for me, but he needed that. And I didn't even know how much he needed to tell me that. So it's just when we stop trying to be so smart about our questions, it doesn't mean we don't want to ask good questions sometimes. It's just it could shape the story rather than letting the person let that story come to them.
It's so interesting to me as you're talking about that, because you're describing very, on the surface, very simple questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're not questions that make you the questioner, the star of the conversation.
Yeah.
And again, so many of us feel like whether we're speaking or asking a question, it has to somehow dazzle or
Yeah.
impress or demonstrate our worth in some way, even if we're not thinking about that consciously. And I think a lot of times we actually are.
Sure, of course. That's what we've been taught to do. Don't come to me with a problem, come to me with a solution. That's what managers tell me. No, come to me with the problem because I want to make sure we're solving the right problem. You can have some ideas, but let's not jump to that, right? Let's just so you're absolutely right. I'm gonna tell your listeners how to become the smartest person in the room.
Please.
Okay. So it's not the questions you ask, it's the story you tell. So we talked about stories, gathering, listen, or telling are the same skill. Most people tell a story to talk or to fill their own agenda. Let me tell you about me. Let me tell you about my service. Let me tell you something about me and what is in it for me. The most powerful story I believe you can tell someone is their own.
Can you talk about that more?
Sure.
Like paint a picture for our listeners, because, I know that this is something you are so skillful at. And, I want to make sure people can actually see the movie in their mind of what
Sure.
what you mean.
Sure. So we call this the flashlight on the listening path. So you're in the woods, you've gotten the speaker's story, you have the compass, you've guided the speaker to tell their story. Most people think they understand at that point. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's only a figment of your imagination because we don't know what we understand because the speaker is completely in the dark about what you heard and understood. So you need to shine a light on it. Tell them the story they just told you. And then you're at the beginning of understanding. So we started out today, you're in the field, listening's important, that it needs to be intentional. You put focus on it, but you still feel like you're kind of terrible at it at times. You ask a lot of questions, you try to make the right decisions, and you're not really sure how to always to put that together, even though you're ahead of the curve on most people, and you're starting to realize more of the impact just by having this conversation is the beginning of me telling the story back to you.
100%. Can I ask a question again that's a little bit of a branch off of this tree?
Sure.
And there's no right answer, but I'm wondering because one thing I'm thinking as you're telling me, you're doing reflective listening, you're telling me that you heard me,
Mm-hmm.
and you're giving me an opportunity to also say, well, yeah, that's right,
Exactly.
but this is not quite. So I feel more understood. And now we have a stronger connection.
Right.
So there is an emotional undercurrent to this. It goes beyond the intellectual. And you were basically suggesting that before.
Mm-hmm.
This is a thing that I'm curious about. We live in an era that I know that you said before that we've always been like this. We're not really wired to listen as well as we really need the skills.
Yeah.
But in the modern era,
Mm-hmm.
we're bombarded with a lot more information, information that's designed to pull us out of the present moment.
Yep.
On our phones and so forth. But also now we are in an era where a lot of people are more aware of having just problems paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say, to me, this isn't a controversial statement, but we're not in the post-COVID era. We're still in the during COVID era.
Yeah.
But there's so much brain inflammation that is making it even harder for people to pay attention well.
Mm-hmm.
have you found over the last few years any change in what people are telling you about their ability to listen or their challenges with listening? And I don't know, maybe yes, maybe no.
Well, there's no question it's adding fuel to the fire. I mean, Jonathan Haidt is the anxious generation. He's a sociologist that has written about this just for our young people, right? So, and adults have it too. It's just our brains aren't forming the same way, which is why it's so dangerous. But we know students are different in classroom. We know that we're different in relationships. We're looking at our phones constantly. So it's not that it's not affecting the problem. It's just not the root cause. It's just another reason. And so it's very addictive. It would be like saying, how are you listening when you're drinking all day? You're impacting the relationship when you're not putting the drink down or putting the phone down. So it's a very real problem. So we have to be intentional about that and turning that on and off in order to be able to tell that story back. You can do it on text, by the way, if you had to. It's not like you can do it on email. I mean, I get questions all the time on email and I don't answer them until I make sure I understand what I'm asking. It just takes more exchanges. So we have to fight the immediacy of just pressing the button or just, getting it a little bit. Because in earlier times, conversations were precious. So there was more space to do it, but we still weren't great at it.
It's really something, right? And again, it's something that, as you're talking about it, I think everybody listening is going to be having this aha moment because it's been right in front of us and it's something we just don't hear enough about. And we, as a society, don't prioritize enough. When you are working with a business or a corporation, what is it that you think is the thing that is hardest for people to get? Or did they get it right away?
Well, getting it right. So the hardest thing to have them do is do enough practice. That's the biggest obstacle because you don't learn anything just doing it one time. So what I've done over the last 8 years is I've really made this as tangible as possible from kids to adults. So we work with schools to little kids now until adults. So I created a game that we use in our workshops. So I say we put listening in people's hands. What I realized is just what's reflective listening. That's a term I'm familiar with, you're familiar with. Some people interpret that as I'll just repeat a little bit of what you say and then that means I've reflected versus no. Tell them everything you heard in 90 seconds, right? That's a different skill. So the game helps with that tangibility so that they can really get the process down pretty quickly. The real habits come when they put more time on the practice. And the game also helps practice. So adoption isn't as hard as it used to be. It's because we've simplified it so much and then people could see it. When you have to move game pieces and get to an overlook, which is what you're seeing behind me, to discover the insight, it changes how people engage because they're listening with their hands, their eyes, their bodies kinesthetically. So the hardest thing to get is time.
I've never heard somebody talk about listening as a kinesthetic experience. That's so interesting that you're incorporating more of the person in the process.
Yeah, how do most people like to learn? If I played field hockey, most people don't know how to play field hockey. So I've taken my hockey stick in and said, let me show you how to do this now, do it. And they're like, no, I want to do it before I have to do it. Like let me do it to incorporate it. So a lot of us like to have some aspect of doing in our learning. And that helps us. If I'm going to drive somewhere and I've driven there myself, it's easier for me to find the route again if I don't have a GPS. So the doing is what really helps because it's like air. Listening's everywhere, but it's nowhere. So the tangibility has really helped.
It makes so much sense. I jotted down a few quotes of yours that I thought were just so interesting and things I wanted to delve into a little bit more. You've already gone over one of them, which was the more knowledge and experience you have, the less likely you are to listen. And by the way, when I heard that, I was thinking of like 10 different people who were like really smart and horrendous listeners.
Yeah. 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 Well,
Because I already know it all.
Well, and we all are a Broadway show. So my dad used to tell me, because he was a businessman, aren't we all doing the same 10 things in our life? Like business lives, we're solving the same 10 problems, maybe. It's like meals. We all have an average 10 meals a week, right? So, but it's new to the person you're solving it for. So the way I look at listening is even if I know the answer, and I sometimes think I do, but that doesn't mean that person wants to feel that way. So it's like when you go to a Broadway show, you don't want to feel like all the actors and actresses have been doing that for 7 days a week. You want to feel like they're the first person they've performed this for. So listening is that experience. You need to be in the movie with them, hearing their story before you dare to offer your solution. That helps bring them along. But they want to feel like this is the first time you've seen the problem. They're not that, otherwise they don't feel that unique or special.
That reminds me of an anecdote you have told about going on your first sales call to meet with a CEO.
One of the biggest sales I made, yes.
One of the things that I loved about your anecdote, which I would like you to tell again, was that you came from such a genuine place. And you really had to, because if you don't know what someone's issue is and you don't listen, I'm not sure what you could offer. But can you tell that anecdote again? Because it was a classic one.
Well, you're giving me a lot of credit. The reality is he wanted me to provide something I didn't have. It was my first.
This was a CEO.
This was a CEO of a orthobiologics company. And I had been introduced to him by the HR person, never met him. And I've still worked with him. He's a very gregarious, charismatic, smart guy, fast moving. And the backstory that I didn't know is he had heard from the board that his team needed training. So he wanted me to talk about training. And I said, well, what do you want them trained on? And he had no idea what the answer was. So I kept asking him, and he goes, well, can't you just put a proposal together? And he handed me this glitzy folder with some training proposal. And I looked at it, and my inner voice went, shit, I don't have this. I couldn't hand this to him if I wanted to. So I just went, I don't have this, and I could put something together, but I have no idea what I'm solving. And I just kept saying no, because I didn't have anything to provide him, and I didn't know what he was asking me. And finally, it's just like my determination that I said, well, would you want me to put this is this valuable to you? And he was like, not really. I go, well, why do you want me to do that then? Because he didn't know the answer. He didn't have the answer. So I said, what it sounds like is you need coaching. When he told me more of the story, and when I said coaching, that's another word he heard from his board. And he went, that's what I need. And now we started to have the real conversation. But it was only because I had nothing in my bag of tricks to provide him that I was like, and it ended up being, a blessing, because what it taught me is, even if I had that, don't pull that out. Don't pull that out. Have the conversation. Get to the heart before you start solving the problem. Yeah.
I think it was a brilliant question to ask. And by the way, like, I don't ever say anything if I don't mean it. So if I give you a compliment, because I actually really think it. And I actually, it sounds like you were really listening also to your own intuition, because in that moment, what happens to most of us, like the super overconfident people will just come up with a BS story.
Yeah.
And that's what people, I feel like, are socialized to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of us, I think, would be like a deer in the headlights. Even the fact that you were honest, I'm impressed by, because a lot of times people feel like they can't be. But I think the fact that you were so real, just as an aside, is so persuasive. Because when you're being honest and being real, I feel like you can listen better too, rather than trying to sell somebody on something you don't have.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wanted to sell some. Don't get me wrong, I was chomping at the bit to work with this. This was a huge opportunity. I had someone tell me just get one good client. Like as I started my first business, and he ended up being actually one of two really good clients that I got and did some amazing work with. But so I'm going to take that in. I appreciate that. I think we do think we need to know when really if we can let the pressure off and say, let me just understand. People don't want, even if the person's telling you to solve the problem, that don't take that bait. As someone as a clinician, I used to have people come in to my office, and I was a young therapist, so I was 30, and I already had 8 years under my belt, but nobody believed that, right? I go, how do you want me to solve the problem? I have my degree behind me, and they're like, I want you to tell me how to fix this. And I went, great, let's go. And then I went, I'm telling you, and you're arguing with me. It's circular. Why aren't you listening? You told me to tell you. And really, what I learned is people, even when they're telling you to tell you, don't buy it because it's a trap. They don't want to be told what to do. They need you to help them buy in so they can figure it out themselves. Don't fall into that trap.
And your great questions lead other people to get insights that are so persuasive for them and help you to help them.
Yeah, like the guy, the sponsor, he told a profound story that he had only told one other time in his life. So something came out of that for him, not just the listener, his sponsee. So that's the connection part. And then if you're looking to business, that's the best way to influence, is to have someone have that experience. Because when they have that experience, they'll go to the wall for you. They'll go to the wall for you.
It's so true. It's so true that listening, again, it's one of the things that, not in your world, it's not underrated, but I think it's generally so underrated, and it forms, as you've mentioned, a stronger emotional connection in a way that, on paper, I think people just don't realize.
Yeah. And why would they? Again, because we don't know what good listening looks like. We don't experience it very often. So even when we experience, how do we describe it? It's hard to describe what just happened when somebody listens really well. The way I know somebody's really listening well is if I'm talking more than I'm listening. I'm with an amazing listener if somebody has me talking more than I'm listening. But most people wouldn't know how to describe that experience. They just know they'll feel profoundly different. I told this in my book too. I was doing keynotes around the country in 2019 before COVID to CIOs, and one of the event planners came up to me afterwards and said, "Everybody loves you, Christine." They just did and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that could not be further from." In my mind, I said they love how I'm making them feel because I'm connecting, I'm listening. Yeah, they connected to me through my stories. That was a fast track because they get to know me a little bit. But now, as soon as we were in a conversation, it wasn't about me, it was about them. And so that's what they're drawn to. I hope there's some substance there after that, but that's really, in that short interactions, that's what they were feeling. Not, they didn't know me yet, but that's what it draws. It's a powerful force when you make it about somebody else.
Your book could have been called The Secret of My Success. Because again, it's just like the secret in plain sight, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a great. Well, you said the word advantage, and that's what I call when I speak. It's the listening advantage. How do you get an advantage? Is through this superpower in relationships and business. And my contention is that we need to teach people earlier in life. It's been ridiculous is the only word I can come up with right now that it hasn't happened. And it's nobody's fault, because how do you teach something you've never been taught to do?
100%. I'm just looking through and this is probably something that you'd advise against, that I have my giant list of things, but I always do. I have to work on it.
Well, you're trying to ask questions for your audience. So
true.
That's a different, I appreciate that, but that is a different animal. You're trying, what your audience wants. So those kinds of questions that lead me to telling them the story they want to hear is a form of listening, because you know what your audience wants to know about. So
Yeah, and I mean, thank you. And as I'm listening to you, and I'm hearing that again, you're teaching this across the lifespan and in different contexts. I think it's so. It's you're not framing this as a form of healing. I know you've talked about it in your work as a therapist, but it really is so healing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think anybody who has ever, I'm sure this has happened to you a million times, and it's happened to me a lot. And I'm certainly not as skilled a listener in the formal sense, I don't think. But, my husband will joke and say, oh, holy cow, you just met that person. And yet again, they've told you
Yeah.
their whole life story.
Yes, I'm familiar with that problem. Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is, you know what? Like, I'm actually interested. And that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the interest, I think, makes up for some of the formal skills deficits, or however you want to think about it, or not being as, polished or whatever. But, you have such great ways of describing how people can use this and also where it goes wrong. I know I'm jumping around, but you have talked about everything from being curious, asking good questions, questions shaping the story. We've
Mm-hmm.
covered a lot of that. Bad storytellers disorient the listener. I thought that
Totally.
was a fabulous quote. And I am guilty, but it almost is like, I'm trying to find a way to verbalize it. I don't know if I can, but it's almost like those sci-fi movies where somebody's like been hit with some weird force field
Yeah.
that they can't see.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And it is, we think the speaker's in charge, and it's a myth. Like, listeners guide the speaker, not the other way around, because speakers will go, like, that's the worry people have. If I don't have that kind of time, is what people think. If I just let someone talk, they will talk and they will. And that's not, listening is about helping guide them to the understanding, not just letting them go wherever they want to go. So, but you need the tools in order to do that, because you're navigating the trail. And if you don't know where you are in the woods, you don't know where to go. So that's the language part of it. And so of course you're a great listener. It doesn't, like, Tom Brady can throw a football, so can I, right? So he's an elite athlete, right? The 1% of the 1%. So if you're 1%, you could still go to the 1% of the 1%. It's just the level of athlete you are. And the more technical you get, the better athlete you become, like anything. So we can all do that, but the only way to do that is if you actually have the language and the tools. In my opinion, you just can't force your subconscious into this.
so I have another question for you that's just popping in my mind, because again, like for me, and I think for my listeners as well, the next best thing to doing it or working with you one-on-one, which some people will,
Mm-hmm.
but for the people who may not yet do that, is there a public figure that you have seen who is like a stellar listener
Mm-hmm.
or a
Yeah.
stellar storyteller or both?
Well, I love that you said that. One of the things we do when we work with clients is we teach them to study great listeners, because that's how you model. So, look, I don't mean to be immodest, but you could listen to me listening. I've done interviews where it flips pretty quickly, right? Even when I've gone to therapy, sometimes the therapist and I are fighting for the control, because I can flip it around. In full disclosure, so that's one area. And there's one I don't have it off the top of my head where I actually interviewed somebody who I'd been on their little television show, and I ended up interviewing them, and I didn't know much about the topic, but I used my listening ability to guide the story. And he told me things that he didn't realize he was going to tell me. But Howard Stern, even though some people,
Oh,
the old
absolutely.
Howard isn't he's a different man since his wife. But when you listen to his celebrity interviews that are longer, you will see the listening path tools that are in my book come to life. They come to life. He's amazing. The other one is old clips of Letterman, and even on his next guest, when you listen to him and what he does in terms of, again, the listening path tools, there's an interview he did many years, like 5 years ago, with Kim Kardashian, where she had been robbed.
Oh, wow.
It's on his My Next Guest, and that portion of the interview, he is just magnificent in terms of how he draws the story out and doesn't get in the story with her and brings out a different level of her, fan or not. Again, this isn't about whether you like the person. It's about what you see in terms of that. He would always go off. He would never use his cards, from what I understand, when he was interviewing. He just talked to the person. He says, take me back to the beginning a lot. He does the storytelling back to people, as does Howard. Howard stops people. Letterman stops people and says, whoa, 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 hold on. Tell me more, when he finds these moments, rather than letting the person run past that. They control the pace of the speaker.
Those are such great examples, and I agree with you at 100%. You can like the person, not like the person, but like observe and listen and learn.
Yeah, yeah.
They are you're 100%. Those are, I think, two of the best.
You'll notice in sitcoms too. The other thing, by the way, another tool is the water filter. Just to go back on the listening path. So you have the compass, you get the story. You have the flashlight, you tell the story back. But you already talked about this. You said, well, then what? So the water filter is, you wouldn't drink water in the woods unless you filtered it, because you'd get sick. We pollute the story. We contaminate the story that we hear with our own thoughts and feelings. So we have to filter that out after we've listened. That's how we get to true understanding. So once you tell the story back to the person, then you use this magical phrase called, it's, do I get you? And when you say, do I get you? Then you listen for yes and means yes, yes and tells you more, or the yes, sort of, you get me kind of response. That yes means no. And now you're in a different paradigm of understanding, because now you're joining into what that really means to understand. And the reason I bring that up is because you don't get me is on television a lot. You'll hear the words, did I get you? You don't get me a lot. It feels foreign when we put it into our vocabulary, but it's all around us constantly. And if you start to listen for it, you'll start to hear it.
That's so true. Embedded in what you are saying throughout the conversation that we have been having, I'm thinking, if I get this wrong, you tell me, humility on the part of the listener, like being willing to receive that feedback.
Yeah. We don't have to get it right. We just have to try. So I have a colleague that I worked with, and he started working with me because he heard me speak, and then he used the path in his own sales. I've gone on to some sales calls with him, but he's a smart guy, and he's like, I purposely miss sometimes with clients. He says, I'll flashlight, and then I'll say, do I get you? And he said, I'll purposely leave something out, because if it's important, they'll tell me that's important. If I left it out and it's not important. So then I'm really drawing on how important is this to the person. So I really understand them. Most of us say this when we understand, that where we think we understand. I understand. That's what most people do. And I go, you're not going to tell me you understand. I'm the only person that can tell me if you understand. So I'm the judge of that. So when we say the words I understand, it has very little to do with understanding and very little to do with the person feeling understood. If you want them to feel understood, tell them the story they told you. Ask them if you get them. Make sure you get a yes and means yes, and work at it until you do. And then you're going to feel like a real understanding happens.
It is so incredibly helpful. And I love when people have tips that are so digestible and impactful.
Yeah. It feels foreign. So I went to Paris this fall. I didn't know how to speak French, but a few words came out of my mouth, and then suddenly I was in a different world. So you just have to take the chance to do it, like that gentleman who tried the 6 questions, or tries let me see if I get you, and tries that flashlight, and then says, okay, I don't get you, keep going. It's just taking the risk to do that and see what happens. And we had a client that worked for a large pharmaceutical company that gathered a story from his daughter, who was 16. One day workshop, came back 2 days later for the second part, and he was in tears. He said, I got the first unsolicited hug in 3 years.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. A guy on the call with his team talking about, he said, I don't know how to thank you.
Oh,
yeah.
That is amazing. what a testament to the power of being heard, too,
Yeah.
right? Of people feeling heard.
And how quickly we can repair the wounds we've caused. Like, we've inflicted so many wounds, those surface wounds that get deeper and deeper and deeper that we don't know about, but they can be transformed when you just start doing it. It's like food. Like, we can be overweight all of our lives and then decide we're going to eat properly and our bodies will forgive us to a large extent. So will our relationships, as long as we do the right things. And what we're doing around listening is probably, this is what I think is unique about it. Two things. One is it's simple language that people can understand, simple tools and language. It's taking all the best principles of listening and marrying it together in a very different way so that there's a step-by-step process and the foundational level so that we can listen in a common way. So when we're in meetings, people following that same process go, wait, we're not going to the next subject. Let me see if I get you. Tell the story of what just happened. Okay, do we believe? Yes, let's move on. Now we're starting to organize how we communicate in a different way. So those principles are all the best practices married in this simple path.
Oh, I love it. So important. Christine, is there anything that I did not ask you that I should have, or anything else we should cover about your book or your trainings or listening in general? Let me know.
Okay. Well, you've asked me some great questions. Obviously, this is my passion. I really, my belief and mission is I really want to help make the world a better place through the gift of understanding. So, if just one of your listeners does one thing that to me, that it's all worth it, because that's how things change through small movements. So the one of the things I'm really excited about is, while we still do a lot our work with organizations, and that will not stop, is that I want kids to learn the skill. So we launched a classroom program in late October, so where we're teaching the skill via an animated program that I'm the teacher, the animated teacher, so the teachers can facilitate all the learning in the classroom. Oh, you have a cat too. My cat's over there. Hi, kitty cat.
For people who can't see, Princess just jumped on my lap because she's so engaged by what Christine is saying.
And Izzy made a half appearance on her head at one point. So, but I want, and by the way, when we teach the kids, we send something home to the parents because we want them to be part of the learning journey.
Great.
The teachers learn. So let's change the world by teaching kids how to listen. That's my mission. So we have this program that is being piloted in Ireland. We're in Canada, in the States. So hopefully within a couple of years, this will be a massive movement where we have listening education for kids in school.
I love that. So what incredible work you're doing. So important. And I love how passionate you are about it.
Thank you.
I mean, it really does come through.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think as I wrote, I had to be the one that saw my mother and understood her pain. And I think, what do? We go into psychology to fix the wounds for ourselves. So when I'm able to give that gift, and because I didn't always get it as a kid, even though my mother was an amazing listener, I had parts of her that way. It feels so magnificent to hear the change in others. And so this is more than a job. This is a healing journey for a lot of things. Yeah.
That's so great. Christine, please tell people where they can find out more about you, find your book, your trainings, and so forth.
Sure. So the book is What Is It Costing You Not to Listen? All the major outlets. Amazon is a frequently, an easy one to get it in any form: Audible, hardback, softback, whatever. Books are like sneakers. You want it the way you want it. You either want it on the Kindle or you don't. So it's available in every form. You can find the listening path at .com, both for business and for educators. There's a demo of our listening path program on the website. And if you're interested in me speaking, you can find me at Christine Miles Listens.
That's so great. Christine, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk about listening, something we can all do more of. It's been so great to get to know you during this
too.
hour and hear more about everything you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
This has been another episode of Unpacking Possibility. If you enjoyed the episode, and I know you did, please remember to like, share, follow, leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. And of course, as always, until next time, be well.